Right. So my topic is the end of communism, and you can't really talk about communism, or at least the end of it, without talking about the revolutions of 1989. And it's strange to hear the term revolutions of 1989 because 1989 was only 24 years ago. To put this into perspective, some other things that came out of 1989 include Bleach by Nirvana, The Little Mermaid, the first season of The Simpsons, and Tim Burton's Batman. Really, it's not that long ago at all, and basically 1989 was a time of huge political unrest in Europe, and a series of short, often really, really brutal revolutions spelled the end of communism's reign in Eastern Europe. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and this marked the end of communism in East Germany, and the beginning of the unification of Germany, but it also marked a huge, huge change in international communism, because this was the destruction of the main iconography of the so-called Iron Curtain. So, before we get into the revolutions of 1989, a background on the Iron Curtain and the Eastern Bloc. So, basically, the Iron Curtain was the blanket term for barriers between the opposing parts of Europe during the Cold War, including fences between the East and West, and most notably, the Berlin Wall. Much of Eastern Europe was under the influence of Soviet Russia, including Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And this group of countries was commonly referred to as the Eastern Bloc. These places were called satellite states as they'd been converted to communism by the USSR. Most of the countries west of the Iron Curtain allied themselves with the United States. Between 1989 and 1991, there were numerous events that signaled the end of the Cold War, and many communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe began to collapse, and these were referred to as the revolutions of 1989. In Poland, there were numerous strikes in 1988, and in 1989, the last communist prime minister of Poland, General Czesław Kiszczak, resigned, and a prominent statue in Warsaw of a previous communist dictator was literally, overthrown, destroyed by the people, because, why wouldn't you hate your communist dictator, On October 27th, 1991, the first impartial elections were held in Poland since the 1920s. It's a long time. After Poland, Hungary was eager to be free of its communist shackles, hungry for capitalism, one might say. On May 2nd, 1989, the fence between Hungary and Austria began to be torn down, and on March 24th, 1990, new legislation was brought in that allowed Hungary to have impartial, multi-party elections. After the dismantling of the Austro-Hungarian fence, many East Germans fled to West Germany through this large gap in the Iron Curtain, and by September 1989, more than 30,000 East Germans had escaped to West Germany, until the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, stopped allowing people entry to Hungary, so they were cutting the East Germans off. And this meant that the only place East Germans could escape to was Czechoslovakia. And so many of them sought refuge in the Prague embassy and the Hungarian embassy, where thousands camped out waiting for political reform in Germany. Literally thousands of East German citizens on the lawns, in the gardens of these embassies, because they were just desperate for refuge, And a series of protests happened in Leipzig, happening throughout September and October, which resulted in really savage beatings and open violence on people protesting. This is where the brutal part of the revolutions came in. This didn't deter the public, however, and on the 2nd of October, over 10,000 people were in attendance, and the military were given clearance to shoot and kill any civilians participating in the protest. Before the next protest on the 9th of October, militia and police were in full force, and there were rumours of a Tiananmen Square-style massacre. But 70,000 people still turned up, and the authorities just refused to open fire because there were so many people, they were severely outnumbered. This is a photo of one of the protests. And so basically, the following Monday, 120,000 citizens attended, and the weeks after that, more than 300,000. And the borders to Czechoslovakia were reopened, and the Czechoslovakia and then Czechoslovakia also reopened their border to West Germany, thus taking down their portion of the Iron Curtain. On 9th November 1989, the GDR caved because of public pressure, and they allowed the destruction of the Berlin Wall and the reintegration of Germany's two halves, basically. And 4 days after this, the Prime Minister and his entire cabinet just resigned, the whole GDR, and a more liberal communist government was formed under Hans Modrow, and on 15th January 1990, elections were held, and the Party of Democratic Socialism, who were essentially running the GDR, was so easily defeated, because these people had been so oppressed, and who would vote for that again? And this is really one of the defining points in the Cold War, because it's where it's showing that it's not about Russia and the US. It's not about huge superpowers with nukes and stuff. It's about this tiny country that's just been so repressed and so just treated so poorly. And really, these revolutions, it was such a turning point, because each one spurred on the other one, and it just gained momentum, and it led to the dissolution of the entire USSR. And the two halves of Germany were officially reunited on October 3rd, 1990. The Velvet Revolutions in Czechoslovakia happened around that same time, and that was non-violent student demonstrations from the 17th of November, with around 500,000 demonstrators congregating in Prague. And in June 1990, Czechoslovakia held its first democratic election since 1948. In Bulgaria, mass protests led to the dethroning of the communist government, and in Romania, the communist leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, was overthrown by his own people and military. He went to Iran for a few weeks, and then he came back, and he asked for a mass rally of people, and when he started to speak, it wasn't adoration, it was boos and jeers, because they hated him. They had been so oppressed, and all this repression had been bubbling to the surface, and anger, and they were just so sick of it, and the military turned on him as well. It was intense. And all this led to the end of the USSR. On December 25th, 1991, the USSR was officially split up into 15 independent states. And this marked the end of the Cold War between the Soviets and the United States. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected leader of the USSR, and he planned to reform the country's failing economy. Here's some photos of Gorbachev. He's been on time 3 times. And some of Gorbachev's political reforms allowed for more freedom for the Soviet states, and many of the outlying states began to rebel, very much like in the Hunger Games, where the other districts start to fight. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia were the first Soviet states to demand their freedom, and they achieved official independence on September 6, 1991. And really, this happened because at this point, essentially the USSR were bankrupt. And they just couldn't afford a military. So at first they resisted, but then they had no power. And so from here, all the other states began to rebel as well, until finally they all declared independence on December 25th. And the USSR was officially dissolved. Officially, there are 4 remaining socialist states in the world. The People's Republic of China, the Republic of Cuba, the Lao People's Democratic Republic, Laos, and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Although these countries are officially still communist, their political systems don't really resemble Marx-Lenin communism at all. So, where are we now with communism internationally? In China, the current political party in power is the Communist Party of China. However, the CPC is also the only political party in the country. The CPC's power is also guaranteed in the country's constitution. And mostly the country runs on a really, really weird mix of authoritarianism with capitalist trade methods. It's seriously whack. The production industry is practically unregulated, with really few environmental and human rights restrictions. And there's no freedom of press, internet, religion, and that doesn't exactly draw from the same concept as Marx and Lenin. In Cuba, things are quite similar. In 1959, Fidel Castro was successful in overthrowing the Cuban government and Cuba's cruel dictator, Fulgencio Batista. The US government were really happy about this as they thought it was a win for democracy. It turns out they were quite democrazy. Castro began to act more and more like the dictators before him, and he failed to hold free elections like he promised and put loads of his political opponents in jail without trial. Things simply went downhill from here, as you've heard in previous presentations. Like, Castro was a revolutionary and he was just scared of another revolution. Things haven't really quite improved in Cuba. They have a little bit, but not much. Essentially, communism never fell. However, the original basis of the ideology has been so warped and nipped and tucked that the modern iterations of communism just don't at all resemble Marx and Engels' vision. Really, communism just can't survive as the basis for a state in the modern world. At least it hasn't yet.